All right, everybody, welcome back from discussions there. Hopefully you had some good discussions about what you like about David and Goliath. That's the count. There's so many different details and different things, and maybe you might pick up something new today or hear something new that will be just inspirational for you in that as well. So let's jump in and start reading 1 Samuel chapter 16. Would somebody read for us verses 1 through 5?
I can read, Pastor.
All right, thanks, Jean.
The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord, and invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him who I declare to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peacefully?" He said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice.
All right, thank you so much, Jean. So as we look at this account here, as we look at the map as what we're going, so I'll share this map a little bit more in detail later. What does God tell Samuel to do is that first question. He says, go to Jesse of Bethlehem and anoint one of his sons king. And that second question, really you have to understand the map a little bit, but what is Samuel worried about? He's worried about Saul. Saul's going to hear I'm going to anoint somebody else king, and he's going to kill me, right? And so Samuel had to pass by Gibeah, where Saul lived, to get to Bethlehem, right? So this is a map of later, but right where this orange line turns to the left, right up here, that's where Samuel lived in Ramah. And so Bethlehem is down here. You just follow that road down. And what do you have to pass right by? What's right on the road? Gibeah, where Saul lives. So here Samuel goes. Remember, Samuel's still recognizable. He hasn't ever cut his hair, right? He looks different. He dresses different. You're up in your city in Gibeah, and you're going to be able to see Samuel passing by. Even if Saul doesn't see it, somebody's going to say, "Hey, Saul, Samuel's going down the road." Saul's going to hear about this. And Samuel's worried of what Saul's reaction is going to be. Where's Samuel going? What's he doing? Why is Samuel traveling? Where's he going? Right? And so Samuel had to pass right by where Saul lived to get to Bethlehem. And so he's worried about what Saul is going to do. So what does Samuel do when he comes to Bethlehem? The elders get all worried. "Samuel, are you coming in peace? Are you coming, or are you coming with the bad word of judgment?" Right? Because sometimes Samuel has come and it's been a good thing, and sometimes Samuel has come and it's been because people are not doing the right thing. Samuel says, "No, I've come in peace. I've come to sacrifice. Come peaceably, and not with a word of judgment." And then he consecrates Jesse and his sons and invites them to come to the sacrifice as well. Any questions so far? So is that setting the stage here? All right, can somebody read for us then verses 6 through 13? Yeah, Sylvia, my dad will bring the microphone for you. 6 through 13.
When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered, "but he is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah.
All right, so thank you. So he gets all of Jesse's sons gathered together there, and he sees the oldest one, Eliab, and Samuel thinks this has got to be the guy, right? He looked the part. He was tall, he was probably strong, and he was good looking. But the Lord said, don't look on his outward appearance. Look at the heart as I look at, I look at the heart. I've rejected him to be king. And we're given much more reason why, just that he doesn't have the heart that God is looking for, right? Remember, Saul looked the part too, but he didn't have the heart either. How many of Jesse's sons did Samuel reject? 7. Where was David? He was tending the sheep. He was out in the fields watching the sheep. And so that could have been near to Bethlehem, or it could have been far away. We don't actually know how long they had to wait to bring Jesse in. But they had to wait at least some point of time to wherever their flocks were being tended for David to come to the feast. And he's caring for the feast so his brothers he's caring for the sheep so his brothers can all be at the feast. So that's what David's doing. So how is David described? He's handsome. He's ruddy, which literally means reddish. So it could imply that he had maybe reddish hair, or maybe that he was had a reddish tone to his skin. But it literally means reddish, but it does imply very healthy looking appearance. That's what it implies. So whether it means he was actually like redheaded or something like that, it means that he was healthy in his appearance. He had beautiful eyes, right? You catch that too? And then what happens when he's anointed? The Spirit of the Lord rushes upon David, and this should be familiar for us. After Samuel anoints Saul, shortly after that account, the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon Saul. And so you get this imagery, you get this, the reality of what happens here is that the Spirit of the Lord is now upon David. And now you're wondering, well, does that mean the Spirit is still in Saul or not? And we're going to find out that it's the latter. That the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul. And there's this dramatic switch that now the Spirit of the Lord is with David and no longer with Saul, even though Saul is the Lord's anointed. All right. So as we kind of just make some personal application here for us, how can we get distracted by outward appearances? Easily. From hairstyles to clothes to look, just to appearance, all those kinds of things, we get so easily distracted and make assumptions and make presuppositions just upon outward appearances, whether or not someone is tall or short. I had a professor at the seminary who was shorter than me, and at his first call, he had more than once had parishioners say, Pastor, we really like you, but we'd like it if you were taller. that somehow he wasn't a good enough pastor because he wasn't tall enough, right? So just the, and he said that to prepare us because like, hey, we still love our people no matter what they say or how they say it, but they had in their mind, this person or these people had in their minds that the pastor had to be taller in order to have authority or whatever they needed to do to be able to preach or teach. And because he wasn't tall, he couldn't be a good pastor in their mind, which we do this all the time with stuff. When I was in high school, I went to a small youth gathering in our area churches. And a lot of us didn't know other people there. And one of the things they had us do is they blindfolded everybody. And then where they were able to get us and lead us into groups. And we had a whole small group conversation of getting to know other people without ever seeing them. There were 5 or 6 people in our groups. And it really helped teach me about, there are some people in there that I might not have talked to had I known what they looked like first. And it really kind of challenged my presuppositions and how I saw people and looked at people, and made some really cool connections with people that would not have otherwise probably happened for them to me or me to them, just because of our outward appearances. And so, isn't it great to know that God doesn't look at the outward stuff? God looks at the heart, and he looks at each one of us, and he loves us so much that he sent Jesus to die for you. He gives you worth and value. He changes our hearts so that they're in line with his. And so for us, it's so easy for us to get distracted by outward appearances, and we don't see to the heart. And that's our challenge for us. So, God made all of us. And we want to have the character of God, to strive for who he wants us to be. And so if we want to be more like God, we need to see people's heart, not the color of their skin or their hair or their clothing or whatever else. To be more like God, we need to see their heart and really interact with people on that level, not on just an outward appearance. So that's just kind of as we look at Samuel. Samuel, here's the man of God. He's been a man of God his whole life. And did he get distracted by the very same thing? Yeah, he saw the outward appearance and said, this is the guy, right? And so it's easy for all of us to do this. And this is a good reminder to constantly be in check with, what am I being distracted by? And what am I really looking at? Comments, thoughts? Yeah, Mom?
It amazes me how trusting and believing Samuel is his whole life. Even though he would have picked probably any one of those 7 sons over David, you don't see him arguing with God here. You just see him, okay, Lord. That to me is also remarkable. I don't see that in myself very often. I usually want to convince God that my way is better, or at least we should give that a try. And the other thing I was going to comment on is, have any of you ever seen that show, The Voice? I've only caught it once or twice, but it's about this kind of thing where the judges have their backs to the singer while they're auditioning. And then if they like the voice, they turn their chair around, which says they're voting for them. And many times you can see the total shock on the faces of those judges as they look at the person, especially considering they're Hollywood types where outward appearance is everything. They turn around and they're like, how can that beautiful voice come out of you? It's kind of a good lesson for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah. So the idea of the voice of the blind picking or choosing someone in the midst of that. So yeah, interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
When we were calling Larry Yoakum, and one of the things that I noticed immediately that he had the tattoo, and it made a certain impression on me. And sometimes you judge people even though, just by what they're doing or what they're wearing.
Yeah, I think, and sometimes, we do this all the time. And a lot of times sometimes we're aware that we're doing it, But a lot of times we're not even aware that we're making these choices and judgments as we go. Thanks for that, Gene. Yeah, Dad.
One of the reasons that pastors in our church wear robes is to cover themselves up so that people aren't distracted by the appearance. But covered by the robe.
The robe of righteousness. Yeah, Christ's righteousness. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good. Thanks for that discussion and that thought just as we look. And so that can be a challenge for you, a prayer for you to, Lord, help me see people's hearts. Help me see their heart, not be distracted by the outward appearance. All right. So so Samuel then goes back to Ramah. And so Saul, he's going back home again. All right. Saul's going to hear about this. This guy is important. So this next section is interesting here. Can somebody read verses 14 through 23? I think it really, Shirley, why don't you read that for us? And this does highlight the difference now between Saul and David. Go ahead, Shirley.
Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendant said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the harp. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes upon you, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Whenever the Spirit from God came upon Saul, David would take his harp and play. Then relief would come to Saul, he would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him.
All right, so a few things going on here that I think are interesting to really look at. One, we have this this play on the word "the Spirit," right? This description of the Spirit. So Saul, does he have the Spirit of the Lord anymore? No, an evil spirit now torments Saul as the Spirit of the Lord has rested on David. And so you get this idea of almost this changing of the guards, this changing of who the Lord is blessing and who the Lord is with. All right. And so to fix this for David, to fix this for Saul with this evil spirit, people around Saul say, well, maybe music will soothe this. We need to get somebody that can play music to soothe Saul's mood, his temperament when the spirit comes upon him. What this actually was or reacted like, we don't know. Did he become melancholy? Did he become agitated? Did he become depressed? We don't necessarily know exactly what this was like for Saul, but music soothed it. And so they seek out an excellent person that's good at playing the lyre, a small harp-like instrument. And David was known for this, not just in his own family, but it's reached the words of Saul's court. And so they bring David before Saul. Saul asked Jesse if David will come and serve him, and Jesse allows that. And David enters Saul's service. He becomes his armor bearer. He's in the court for all these things. So that's what happens to Saul. The spirit departs from him, and David comes and does this. So what's interesting here is an amazing way how God is preparing David. Right. So here's someone who's been anointed king. He's the youngest of his brothers. He's probably only ever been in charge of maybe some hired servants and the sheep, because he's the lowest of the pecking order in his family, right? But here he now is able to observe the king's court, to see the inner workings and the inner dealings of how King Saul runs the country. He has a front row seat and a great education for what it means to be king, and how to interact with his people, his troops, his generals, all of those things. God puts David in this position to begin to prepare him for the leadership that's going to come, even in the midst of all of this. There is a little bit of an interesting kind of time reference here, a time problem reference. Because when you get to the next chapter with David and Goliath, when David is not with the army, he's not with Saul, he's not being Saul's armor bearer, he's still tending the sheep. And when David goes out to fight the battle, Saul turns to his brother or his cousin, the general, and said, "Whose son is this?" And he doesn't seem to know David at all. And so you're like, well, wait a minute, how does this work together? How does this jive if David's already in his service? And the problem with that is that we're thinking like 21st century American people. Okay, when we look at how life and how we would write history and how we would do history, we are very much A happens, then B happens, then C happens, then D happens, then E happens, all in a straight, orderly line, right? That's how we write history. We have to get it chronologically in order. If we don't, then we're somehow messing up the story, or we're deceiving people. We're not telling it right. That's our convention with how we write history. That's a very much modern way of thinking and writing history. For the Israelites, for the ancients, not just the people of Israel, but for the ancients, they're much less worried about getting the specific details in chronological order as they are with ordering the themes. Right? So that's why sometimes we have major jumps. It's like, well, that's been like 20 years because now all of a sudden Jonathan's old, right? Or Saul has kids now and they're in the army. Like, what happened in between? Well, that's not what's important. Or the writer of 1 Samuel, what's important is showing how God's at work in the history and moving things forward. And so here, what we see the difference is what is the author of 1 Samuel focused on? He's focused on who has the Spirit of the Lord. And so what account best highlights that the Spirit of the Lord is only with David and not with Saul anymore? Well, it's this idea or this fact that this evil spirit torments Saul, and that David comes, and through David, Saul's spirit is soothed. Even though as we look chronologically, it probably makes better sense chronologically if this section is after David and Goliath, right? Because of the timing and this Saul knowing David and all of those things. Yeah, go ahead, Dad.
It could be like one of those movies where they show you something and then there's a caption 5 days earlier.
Yeah.
And they jump back.
Yeah.
And fill you in on what
Yeah.
happened.
And so that would be a good convention for us where storytellers would do that today, but we have to be very explicit of like, now we're jumping in time, where for them, they're not worried about that at all. Their readers aren't worried about that because they're really tied in with these themes of, now we're focused on David is anointed, the Spirit is with him. Oh, and by the way, the Spirit explicitly is not with Saul. And they don't want you to miss that, so they're going to tell you that first, even though another event might have happened before it. Right? For our linear Western way of thinking, that sometimes is like, well, but we'd have gotten it had they done it later, right? Maybe, but they're more circular in their thinking and their writing, where they're going to go from theme to theme to theme instead of always only in a linear line. They still have that linear connection with things, but it's not only that chronological connection. Right. So, and it could be that Saul, he knows him and knows of him, but he's just a servant and whatever else, so it doesn't really matter until he's a threat. And so that's a possibility too. And then your chronology can line up just how it is this way too. All right. Yeah, Dad, did you have another thought?
Do you want to comment on the evil spirit from the Lord?
Yeah, why don't you comment on that?
Well, God is in charge of everything, and whether he allows it or sends it, it's not really much different. Certainly, it's a change from having the Spirit of God.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the idea here is, you know, Saul's made his bed, all right? Saul's made his bed with his choices. Saul's made his bed with, you know, to use that expression, you made your bed, now you have to lie in it, right? So Saul's made his bed with his choices, with his rejection of God's word. And when we remove God's word and don't listen to God's word, we open ourselves up to all kinds of other things. And so God is allowing the Spirit or sending the Spirit either way. And it's not God being mean or vindictive. It's Saul reaping the fruits of what he's sown. Yeah, Mom, with the microphone.
Would we say it's the same thing as God hardening Pharaoh's heart?
Yeah, so God hardening Pharaoh's heart, right? So the first, if you go back to Exodus, and Moses goes to Pharaoh, and for a while, Pharaoh hardens his heart and will
I'm
not
in Bible class.
of the words.
Okay, I just wanted to know how David was.
I'll call you later.
The words of the Lord in that. And he won't listen, and he won't listen. And so it goes back and forth where the Lord hardens his, and then where Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then you get to a certain point where it says, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Because it's that almost confirming of the struggle or the rejection of God's word that Pharaoh does. I think it's very similar in that way. All right. Any other thoughts or comments? Go ahead, Lois.
When I read this section, I'm also impressed with how David is using even the smallest of the gifts that God has given to him. It was the gift of music that brought him to the palace or in the life of Saul so that he could even learn all the techniques about being in the kingdom and getting even after he's anointed.
Yeah. So God uses different gifts and different opportunities. Who knew that music would open the door for David to learn all these things, right? But that's exactly what happens. Yeah, great. Good. When David begins to serve, just to finish up that question 10, Saul loves him greatly. David becomes his armor bearer. So he's not only learning the things of the palace, but he's also learning the things of war and military. And David, whenever David plays the lyre, Saul is refreshed. That's what happened when David begins to serve. So he gives to Saul, provides for Saul in the midst of that. And you think about this for David, what an awkward position for him to be in. You know, that he is the new Lord's anointed, right? He's been anointed prince over Israel, but he has to go and serve the king. You know, and so David knows that at some point and some time that he is going to become the ruler of Israel. He doesn't know when, but he has a choice to make. Do I try to subvert Saul, or do I trust in God and allow God's timing to work out whenever that's going to be and serve my Lord's anointed with all that I have and am? And for many folks, they might have said, you know, I'm going to make this happen. But not David. David trusts in the Lord and his time and in his ways. And so he serves faithfully Saul with all his heart. And we're going to learn in subsequent weeks where David has opportunities to end Saul's life. He's even encouraged to do so because Saul is seeking his life. And David doesn't do it because he's like, I'm not going to harm the Lord's anointed. Who am I that I would take his life into my hands? This is who God has set apart for our leader. And so we even see there David's heart in the midst of these things, that he trusts in God's timing, even in the midst of all of these things where he can't see or understand what's coming. All right, good. Let's go ahead and read this next section. We're going to get into 17. My Bible heads this David and Goliath, right? So we actually get to, this is the For many people, the most well-known story from 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 3. Can somebody read that for us and set the stage here? Yeah, wait for the microphone. Judy up here will read for us. 1 through 3.
Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to show you this map again. I'm going to show you some pictures too that I was able to take on my trips to Israel. So we have this map here. And I don't know if I 100% agree with all the lines on it, but if we follow that orange line, on the right there is Gibeah. And Saul came from Gibeah, and he came down to the army in the Elah Valley down here. Now, it's possible he went down this Ailon Valley. That's the army of last week when they were chasing the Philistines down in the coastal plain. That's the way they went. And then he'd come down through the Shephelah to the Elah Valley. It's also very probable and possible that Saul would have come down towards Bethlehem and taken the same route to the Elah Valley that David had. These pinkish, purplish lines, whatever color that is, from Ekron and Gath, they came. There's Azekah, and this is the Elah Valley. And so what are the Philistines trying to do? Remember how they had garrisons in Israel before? They were trying to control the Israelites and the trade routes and make sure that they were subject to them and all those things. Well, Saul's done a pretty good job with Jonathan's help, right, of getting them out of the central part of Israel. But now it looks like they're making another surge. Maybe, they've got their weapons, they've regathered their forces and their strength. And so they make a push. It's been probably years since that last battle we learned about last week. And they make a push, and they're trying to get back up into the hill country. Well, there's really 3 good valleys that they can kind of approach that and have the easiest roads up in there. The southernmost one is the Elah Valley. And so that's where they start to go. And so they're sending this huge army up. And what does Israel do? They come down and they stand kind of right at the mouth of the pass that goes up. And they said, no, you're not coming up here. And Israel stands kind of there as in blocking the road, blocking the path. They're a little higher up in the hill or the valley, which means things like chariots and other things, when you get into the hills, they aren't as effective. And so they're able to kind of be at a standstill. Israel can't go down into the valley because the Philistines have the better implements of war for that. Israel's better at guerrilla warfare when you get up into the hills. And so they're at a standstill. And this is where they meet. So I want to show you a couple of those pictures then as we look at this. So this is a picture of the Elah Valley. And as I'm there taking this picture, I'm standing in Azekah, or the ruins of Azekah that Judy just read about. You heard that name that she had. For us, that doesn't mean anything. It's just another name that's hard to pronounce. For the people of Israel, they would have known exactly where this city was. Azekah guards the valley as you come up. So this is a critically important city. Because to get by or to get up into the hill country, to the heartland of Judah and Israel, you have to go right by or through this ancient city. And so this is Azekah, and I'm looking, the valley is running east and west. And so I'm looking I'm on the south end of the valley. I'm looking more towards the west and a little bit so I'm facing northwest basically. So out to the left, if you keep going, is going to be Gath and Ekron. As you go out to the mouth of the valley, it's going to widen out into the coastal plain. So standing in the same spot, now I'm looking to the right. The valley still stretched below me. Now I'm looking more towards the east. And the hills are starting to rise a little bit more that way. The white things down below, they're doing some agriculture there in modern Israel. And oftentimes in Israel, they will put these netting over their crops. It helps keep moisture in because water is at a premium, and it also helps keep the bugs out. And so that's what that looks like. But I'm standing in Azekah, and to my right, kind of the next hill over would be Soka. And so it's possible that somewhere down in the valley, just like where those crops are, might have been where the Philistines were camped, because they were camped between Azekah and Soka. All right, so moving a little farther down. So we went down the hill, we rode our bus over to the farther up the valley to the right. And I turned up, and this little mound there, that's where Soka was. So the ruins of Soka are there. And I turn from that out to the valley. You can see some trees there, some crops that are growing, but you can see the valley spread out. So there's valleys cut in. You can see how those would be good for an army to come up. It's a good approach. The farther we can get in there on good level ground is great. But farther to the right now is where the battle, where Israel would be gathered for this battle. This picture took the first time I went to Israel. I'm on now the north end of the valley. So off to the right, you see those hills. That's where Soka would be, in Azekah farther to the right. And where I'm standing, I'm looking at the very end of the valley, where it kind of comes together, and you see the hills kind of overlapping each other there. That's where the end of the valley would be. And so that's where Israel had been gathered kind of right around in here, the end of the valley, and Philistines probably somewhere right over there, at the end of the valley there. What's interesting is where I'm standing in this picture is in a ruined city that has 2 gates. You're like, well, what does that matter, Pastor Becker? That's just kind of weird, right? Why would a city have 2? Well, cities often only had 1 gate because they're more defensible that way, but this city actually has 2 gates. And we're going to hear at the very end of chapter 17 about how when some of the Philistines were fleeing out of this valley after David kills Goliath, that they fled back to their cities of Ekron and Gath, and some of them fled through Sha'arim. Sha'arim means 2 gates. And so some of them probably ran down the valley, but the Israelites could easily chase them that way. So some of them probably ran up to the hills to try to lose them in the hills, and seemingly ran right through where I was standing here taking this picture, what they think is the city of Sha'arim. Now in David's day, when he fought Goliath, the city wouldn't have been there, right? We've talked about that of naming things before, right? Of like, you're telling people the names so that they know where it is. But this city, it seems from the archaeological evidence that David built it later in his reign. Now, why would David build a city at the mouth of this valley? First, victory is there. He knows that they're vulnerable in this valley. And so he's building a fortification here. It would have had a garrison there too. But yeah, it was a small walled fort, basically, city. Had 2 gates. And so and they fled by where Sha'arim is today. That's not how it's worded in our Bibles, but that's really what the author of 1 Samuel is saying. They fled by where Sha'arim is. They fled through Sha'arim. And so it's kind of interesting. You see these little different connections and things. And as you look at, like I was actually able to stand where they think this was and connect that there. So there's a brook that runs through this valley where David would have had the opportunity to grab stones and those kinds of things too. So that's a little bit about some of the pictures and the map of what's going on in this account. As we look at those first 3 verses, we hear names like Azekah and Soka, and sometimes our eyes just glaze over. We hear things like the Valley of Elah, and we're like, what does that really mean? But to maybe have put it on the map and then to see those actual pictures of like, okay, this is a real place. It was a decently broad valley, not super broad, but broad enough where you could have people gather together and battle lines be drawn and those kinds of things. So you can begin to picture that a little bit in the actual place. All right, so let's, Elah Valley between Soka, Philistines bring their army in the battle. If they would have been able to go up into the hill country, Bethlehem was about 5 to 10 miles away. So not too far up from the base of that valley. You could hike and be there in half a day or less. Right? So Hebron was to the southeast, maybe 10 to 15 miles. And so Saul brings his army down. It is in the hill overlooking the valley. All right, so can somebody read for us 1 Samuel? Any questions on that, first of all? Sorry, before we move on to our next section. All right, would somebody read for us then 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 4 through 11? Yeah, Elaine? Get introduced to our villain here, the antagonist, Goliath.
And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. And he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so how is Goliath described? Humongous, he's tall, right? So yeah, so we have this kind of term 6 cubits in a span. A cubit would have been about, it was the distance from the tip of your middle finger to the point of your elbow. And so it's about a distance of 1.5 feet. And it was always, well, if you have longer arms and you have a longer cubit, so how do you figure that out? So typically what you had was a king's cubit. And so the official cubit was the distance from the king's finger down to his elbow. And so could that change? Yeah, but it was at least standard during that king's reign. And so it's about 1.5 feet. And so if you're doing the math, you're looking at about 9.5 feet tall. All right. There is a note, there is a little bit of discrepancy. The Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and Josephus, who was a leading historian just after the time of Jesus, they both say 4 cubits instead of 6 cubits. And so the question is, which one is correct? So if it's 4 cubits, you're looking at about 6.5 feet tall or 9.5 feet tall. Either way, most Israelites at this time, from some of the records and things that they've shown, are about 5 feet tall. So whether the guy's 1.5 feet taller than you or 3 or 4 feet taller than you, either way, they're going to feel like and seem like a giant, right? If you've ever been around basketball players, I'm 5'9", and if I'm around a basketball player that's like, 6'6" or 6'10", they feel like a giant to me. And so imagine if you're only like 5 foot tall and you see somebody that's 6.5, 7 feet tall, they're going to feel like a giant every bit as much as the guy who's 9 feet tall. Either way, Goliath is huge. He's intimidating. He's imposing. He's wearing armor that weighs shekels, and we're like, well, what does that even mean? The note in my Bible said that his breastplate alone, his armor that covered his chest, would have weighed about 125 pounds. right? So that's just his, not to mention the things that cover his arms and his legs. His spearhead would have been about 15 pounds. So not only to carry that, but to hurl that in a way that can, go over distance and force. Goliath is strong and imposing. He is every bit of the imposing figure we think him to be. And I don't care if you are, want to think he's 9.5 feet tall or like 7 feet tall. Either way, it's going to be just super imposing for the people of Israel. Describes his, his bronze helmet, his coat of mail, his armor, his javelin, all bronze and heavy. And his shield bearer goes before him. So this is, he's got his own entourage that helps him carry some of this stuff in the midst of all this. And then Goliath suggests how they should do combat. And what that is, what he's describing is, he's saying, I'll fight for the Philistines, and if I win, you serve me, and you pick your best guy, and if they win, then we'll serve you. And that's called representative combat. And it happens throughout history, where instead of armies fighting against armies, a champion from each army will fight, and whoever wins, well, they win the battle, they win the victory, and it saves lives. It saves some of the messiness of battle. It doesn't decimate the population and some of those kinds of things. And so it was a common way to avoid widespread combat. So Goliath is the likely champion for the Philistines. And after hearing him described, we know why. Who's the likely champion for Israel? Saul. Why? He's a head taller than everybody else. So let's just suppose that Goliath is 7 feet tall. The Israelites, most Israelites are 5 feet tall. Saul's got, a good 6 inches on every other Israelite. So he's 5.5 to 6 feet tall. He's not that much different from Goliath, maybe in height. He's the trained warrior. He's the one that they wanted to lead. You want a king that's going to lead us in battle over our enemies in victory. Saul is the likely choice. And if not Saul, well, then Jonathan. Those are the folks that should be going into representative combat for Israel. And as we look and think about representative combat, just a way to go spiritually for this, really who fights for Israel? God, right? That's really who should, right? God, Saul and everyone else should be saying, God, take care of this Philistine for us. You're who we're choosing to be our champion and our warrior. But that's not, as we'll read here in a little bit, what happens. Saul isn't choosing himself. He's not putting Jonathan forward, and he's not going and turning to God to fight their battles for him, right? He's looking only at outward appearances and not looking at the heart of the matter. Right. So what's the reaction for Saul and all Israel? It says Saul and all Israel are dismayed, and they're greatly afraid. Right. 17 verses 12 through 18. Would somebody be willing to read that for us?
I can.
All right. Thanks, Lois.
Now David was the son of an Ephraimite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shemaiah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit and see how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. Now, how far was I
I
going?
think that's good. We went a little farther, but that's great. That's perfect right there. Thank you. All right, so how long are the Israelites camped? 40 days they're facing there. And this would have been in the spring, kind of after the first harvest. That's when the kings went to war. And so the first harvests are gathered in and they're just waiting for the next one. And so they're going to war, but it's been 40 days. And they're ready for battle. And David is, in that whole time, he's going back and forth. Right? This is not the first trip down to see his brothers that he's taken, but it describes he's going back and forth. And what's he doing when he's doing that? He's resupplying his brothers, and his dad is making sure that his brother's commander is taken care of. Right? I want my family to be in good graces to my son's commanders. Maybe he won't give them the toughest assignment. Maybe he won't put them first in the battle lines, right? Whatever reason, right? Jesse is honoring his kid's commander there, the 3 oldest sons. David is either not of fighting age, which we probably think that is going on, or that, the balance there, but there's only 3 of his 7 brothers that go. And so we don't know how old they are, or if only certain ones had to go, or what that all looked like. But David is tending the sheep and going back and forth. Whenever he tends the sheep, he's giving them in place of a hired hand or a hired helper there. All right. And so David is bringing, and so he's also supposed to bring back word that they're alive. So some kind of token or letter or stamp or something from the boys to give back to their dad to say, hey, Dad, everything's okay, we're good. And so David's doing this kind of trip. If you're looking at the distances between 5 and 10 miles, from Bethlehem down to the Elah Valley, that'd be an easier trip because you're going downhill most of the way. If you're thinking you can do, if you're hiking 3 miles in an hour, or 3 miles every hour, which is 20 minutes a mile. So he's probably doing 3 to 4 miles. So he's doing this in a matter of 2 to 3 hours. He can leave Bethlehem and be down in the valley of Elah, right? 2 to 3 hours. So not very far, right? If you think about that, that'd be like, it's closer than like from here to Crystal City, right? The distance between where this battle is fighting and the threat of the Philistine army is closer to them than from here to Crystal City. And so if you think about the distances there, now they're walking all of that or going on horse, but it's right in their backyard. This is an imminent and immediate threat, right? So they're dealing, this is not a battle's happening somewhere far away from here. I think we have that concept, right? When we send our military off to war, it happens halfway around the world. Not for them, not here. It's happening in their backyard. If their military fails, not like a month later or a week later, that day the enemy army would be ransacking and burning their home. I mean, so that's get word that everything's okay. We want to know the update. And so these couriers can go back and forth. David probably was supposed to be back home that night, and so this is what's going on in the context of the battle that's here. Okay. 19 through 27. Can somebody read that for us? Mom, you want to do that?
And they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took their provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him.
All right, thank you. So this is maybe not the way we would tell this, right? In a modern telling of this, David would just, hey, what's going to be done for the guy who would kill Goliath? Oh, it's going to have this, and this is going to happen, right? Well, the author here says, this is what all of the men knew. They knew what Saul had promised whoever killed Goliath. And then and David asked them, what will be done, right? So it's almost backwards that we get this telling in our conventional way of doing that. But that's how that goes. And so David arrives at the camp and he sees the men going out to the battle lines there. So he leaves the provisions for his brother and for the brother's commander. He leaves that with the guy carrying, or just kind of the servant handling the baggage. And he goes out and greets his brother. And while he's doing that, Goliath comes out as he's done every day for 40 days. He makes fun of Israel, makes fun of their God, makes fun of their armies, makes fun of their king, and calls them out to send a champion to fight against him. And David hears it. He sees Israelites run away in fear. And David said, is wondering about the reaction, about what's going on, about why this is like, isn't Saul offered a reward? Why is nobody going for this, right? And what's going to be done for this guy? And he sees this not necessarily only as a physical threat. He sees this as an attack on his God. He sees this as a spiritual issue, right? How can this guy defy God's people and God's army? God is more powerful than any enemy that we've ever faced. How can this guy be allowed to do this? And so David, in his youth and maybe in his innocence, is kind of like, who's going to fight this guy? Somebody take care of this guy. God's not going to let this stand. Why are we letting this stand, right? And so that's the reaction that David gives. And so just to be clear, what was going to be given to whoever defeated Goliath would be that he would have the honor of marrying the king's daughter, which means you're now part of the king's family. And that's a huge honor. Your family is now free from all taxation. You never have to pay taxes again to the king ever. And in addition to that, you're given great wealth. And so you're becoming basically a prince of Israel. And with the wealth and the status to do what's needed in the midst of that. So that's what the king's promising. Any questions, thoughts, comments at this point? All right, let's continue on then. Can somebody read 1 Samuel 17, 18, or 28 through 37? 28 through 37.
I can read, Pastor.
Thanks, G.
Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they were repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears. this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you.
So we get two responses here. We get Eliab's response, David's brother, and then we also get Saul's response. And when Saul hears about this, and so when the older brother hears about this, and so you have this. This is almost a classic older brother, youngest brother kind of thing. The oldest brother constantly looking after his youngest brother. Maybe feeling put upon that he has to take and carry the slack, that his youngest brother gets away with everything, that is kind of slacks off responsibility, and the younger brother feeling like the older brother, nothing's ever good enough and all. So we have these kinds of things that still go on in life today. Just because one of you's been anointed king of Israel doesn't mean it changes that family dynamic. And so you get this sense of the exasperation of Eliab. Here, we're trying to do the right thing. David, you don't even know what you're talking about. You're embarrassing me. You're embarrassing our family. Why are you even here, David? Stop making, waves. Just keep your head down. Get back with the sheep, right? And so Eliab responds. He's annoyed with his younger brother. He thinks he's just seeking attention. He thinks he's just trying to see the battle. He doesn't really see, all he sees is the outward appearance. He sees his brother just as his annoying little brother. He doesn't see what God sees in the midst of that. And then we get, but David, right, he's not deterred. David keeps asking, and he keeps kind of like, what's going to be done? Who's going to do it? Who's going to fight against this guy? God's going to take care of this. Who's going to do it? And when Saul hears about this, he sends for David. He brings David into his very tent. And Saul asks him, like, David, what are you doing? And David says, I'll fight him. Nobody else has to worry. I'll take care of it. I've defeated bears and lions. God will deliver me from Goliath just as he delivered me from bears and lions. And he compares Goliath basically in the same way. Yeah, they've got big teeth. Yeah, they're ferocious. Yeah, they're strong. But God's bigger. God will deliver me just as he's delivered me before. And so he compares Goliath to an animal in that way. All right, questions, comments, thoughts? So here is the youngest amongst everybody there, and he's the only one pointing to the work and the might and the protection of God. Everybody else is looking to their own strength and their own might, and they know they don't have it. And so they're afraid. What's interesting, Saul lets him do it though, doesn't he? Saul, again, doesn't show any leadership and he lets this guy this young kid go and fight Goliath. If this is really representative conduct, he is gambling the safety of his people on some young kid. So again, not showing the leadership probably that he should or needs to in the midst of this. Okay. Let's keep going here. 38 through 47. Would somebody read that for us? Yeah, Jim, you want to read that for us? Go ahead.
38 to 47.
Yep.
Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with a sling in his hand approached the Philistines. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give you flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field.
47.
Oh, I'm sorry. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give your carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands.
Great interchange there between David and Goliath. So Saul prepares David for battle. He gives him his own weapon, his own armors. He looks like a king. And David's like, I can't use this. I can't move. I might be protected, but this isn't me. And so he takes that off. He takes his staff in his hand. So you had a shepherd's crook, but the shepherds also would carry a rod. One was used for protection, and the other one was used more for attacking wild animals and other things. And David takes with him his sling and 5 smooth stones. I brought with me today a sling. This one's made out of like hemp cord. Probably David's would have been made out of leather. But basically what would have happened is David would have put one of the smooth stones inside the pouch, kind of had that folded over. He'd put the other 2 ends of the string in his hand, and I'll scoot back so you can see on the video too. And he would begin to twirl it around and then get it over his head, get it going. And then he would release one end of the string, and the stone would hurl out and go towards its target, right? That's how the sling would work. And these guys were accurate, as accurate as anybody with a bow and arrow would be. And so they were trained in this. They could hit a target doing this with great precision. There are actually competitions still today that go on with slings, and they're hitting bullseyes and targets and all those kinds of things today. And actually in David's day and age, where you'd have a company of archers, you would also have a company of slingers. And so these were this wasn't just like some fluke thing for David. David was skilled in this, and he trained with this. You think about watching the sheep, he's probably practicing all day long, right? He's trying to, I gotta hit that tree trunk over there, and he's gonna be doing that just all day long as he's with the sheep. And so David takes what he knows with him, and he goes and fights Goliath. And they had this now interchange about what is going on. So Goliath's reaction to David is he sees this boy coming out to him, and he has this saying, and he mocks him and says, I'm going to feed you to the birds. David's response is, well, you come at me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come at you with the Lord's name. David realizes this battle is not about might or strength. It's about his God. And David returns and says, I'm going to strike you down and cut off your head, right? That second part usually gets left out of the children's stories, right? And I'll give, in this part too, I'll give your Philistine buddies' bodies to the birds too. And the world will know that there's a God in Israel because the battle belongs to the Lord. So David responds, it's faith-filled. It's just as aggressive and gory as Goliath, but not because of David's strength or might, but because he knows God will deliver him and God will fight this battle for him. All right. Any questions or comments?
Pastor, is there some kind of significance as to why there was 5 stones?
So I've heard people comment on this that and I've only seen it really in one place, and so I haven't done more research on this, but it seems that there were 4 other of these kind of giant type people like Goliath, 4 other warriors, And it's been thought that these were brothers of Goliath. And in the ancient world, if you kill someone, their family's going to come after you. And so what David is basically saying here is what some people have said David is saying by gathering 5 smooth stones is, Goliath, I've got a stone for you and I've got one for each of your brothers. Is what some people have said. Why 5?
Pastor.
Yeah, so whether that's the reality or not, that's been one explanation of why 5 smooth stones. Otherwise, Gene, there isn't beyond that. I've not heard a really good explanation for why 5 in the midst of that, just to be prepared. Lois, I don't know if you comment on that or something else, but.
Well, my question was, you showed us the pictures and it seems to be more of a, I mean, I realized there was greenery and hill, but where was this stream then that he found these 5 smooth stones?
Yeah, it was right along the edge of the, it had been right along the edge of one of the hills there, right on the edge of the valley.
Is there still a stream there today then? Okay.
Yeah, and most of the time they don't have tourist bus stop there because otherwise they pick up rocks. And I guess there's a story goes that for a while they were just bringing in more rocks and having them like dumped there so that people could take them. So yeah, but they don't necessarily have the tour buses stop at those places anymore when they go through that. But yeah. So they bring him in from somewhere else. They're probably shipped in from China or something like that. But yeah, so that's, but there is still a stream there, that river, that stream of coming out. It won't have water in it necessarily all year round, but during the wet season, during the winter months, it would. Yeah. All right, so we really don't know for sure why 5. I can't remember that section about the other giants, the other ones like Goliath, that comes up in 1st or 2nd Samuel. I don't remember for sure.
I think it's in First Chronicles.
First Chronicles. And so I might look that up again this week and see if I have a better answer for you, Gene, for next week. Okay. All right. So let's kind of finish. We'll get almost done here. I'm going to go ahead and read this next section. When the Philistine arose, verse 48, and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him, and David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath. This part also is in the Sunday school account. All right, and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'arim, where I was standing, right, as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put the armor in his tent. So here's David carrying on the head of Goliath all day long, right? That part doesn't make the picture in the Sunday school book, does it? Or the children's book. But that's what David, he's killed the champion. He's carrying around. This is a trophy. He also takes the armor of Goliath and brings that into his own tent as well. Now, Jerusalem is not yet conquered by David, so this is one of those time things. It's a little interesting of when did he actually take the head of the Philistine of Goliath to Jerusalem. But when he conquers that as his capital, he still has this head and he brings it to Jerusalem. And so kind of an interesting thing with that. But the armor of Goliath, he keeps with him. Even the sword of Goliath comes up in another later account. David kills Goliath as a result of the battle. Stone struck him in the head. David cuts off Goliath's head with Goliath's own swords. Israel went after the Philistine, chased them all the way back to their cities. Ekron was about 10 miles away. And then the Israelites came back and took the spoil out of the camp, the tents of the Philistines. David takes the head of Goliath to Jerusalem, not yet in Israel city, but his armor goes to his own tent. Okay. So that's the result of the battle. And 55 through 58, for time's sake, I'll go ahead and read that. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of his army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, and the head of the Philistine in his hand still. Right? And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. All right, so that last account makes it think like, well, Saul is not just saying, wow, who is this guy? This is awesome. Like anybody knows who David is. He asks Abner, the commander of the army, who's in charge of security for the king. And if this guy had been in the palace already, then he'd have known exactly who David was. But Abner doesn't know yet either. This is probably why they knew who David was in the previous chapter. They probably even knew that he was a musician because he maybe brought his lyre with him or something, and was playing or singing that night in camp afterwards. Who knows? But this, you can kind of see the timing order and why that kind of, again, the theme of the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul and gone on to David. And because he has the Spirit of the Lord, he is now also able to defeat Goliath. And we see the evidence that he trusts in the Lord in the midst of these things. All right. Saul asked Abner, whose son is this? And we kind of explained and talked about these things. So let's just take for a few minutes here and just kind of overview this. Contrast David and Saul in terms of their faith, of their trust in God, their zeal for God's name, leadership, their spirit. Contrast David and Saul a little bit. What are some of the differences between David and Saul as you see that? Yeah, so
I think so.
Go ahead, Lois. We're getting the microphone.
I think Saul trusts more in his own might and power and his strength and leadership and thinking who great he is. And David totally relies on God and his ability to sustain him.
Trust in self for Saul and trust in the Lord for David. Yeah, great difference. Sylvia?
Well, when David says, well, I went against lions and bears to protect the flock, and God gave me the power. It's not on my own skill that I killed the lion and the bears. He says, God did that. God protected me. So he points his actions towards God's help and protection. And he doesn't say, oh, I relied on my own, power and skill, right?
So who they trust in, again, even a good example of that. Mom?
The phrase doesn't seem to come out here yet, but it comes out over and over and over again. David was a man after God's own heart, and it's all the way back to the very beginning of God sees the heart of David, and also David gives his heart to the Lord. So it's that contrast. It's huge.
Yeah, David seems to not only have the heart of God, man after God's own heart, but he has the eyes of God. He sees clearly the situation through the eyes of faith, where Saul does not. Other thoughts? Any other contrast between Saul and David? Saul trusts in armor. David trusts in the Lord. Yeah, Shirley, go ahead.
Wasn't Saul the one, excuse me, that hid in the beginning when when he was anointed? And he seemed to not want to take on what God had planned for him. But David just goes on right on out there. And that seems like a big difference.
Yeah, and so you even have the baggage, right? Saul hides among the baggage. David drops things off with the baggage guy so he can go out and check out the battle, right? So there's just their difference in response. That's a good connection, Shirley. Yeah, really good. Any other thoughts? All right. Yeah, so good with that. So we talked about this a little bit. David's showing a different kind of heart than Saul. That really leads into some of those differences that's there. David trusts in the Lord, right? David says the battle belongs to the Lord, and he's looking to the Lord to make things happen. Where Saul, throughout not just this part, but even through earlier episodes, he's trying to make things happen. I'm going to offer the sacrifice. I'm going to change the words of God to make it fit what I want, where David says the battle's the Lord's. And we see David's heart in the midst of that. And so how do we then, to make this a personal application, how do we display a heart like David? How do we display a David heart in our lives? As we look at the world, as we follow Jesus as we do these things? How do we do this? What does that look like for us? Yeah, Elaine.
When we turn things over to God and say, whatever your will is, I'll do that.
Yeah, we trust in the Lord even though we don't know what the outcome is, right? Lord, whatever you will, I'm there, all right? I'll follow you. Yeah, Mom?
And that involves recognizing who we really are before God, that it's not ours, our battle, it's the Lord's.
It's a great, we recognize that the battle's not our battle, that it's the Lord's battle. Anybody online have a thought or comment? I don't want to overlook you guys. Yeah, go ahead, Lois.
I think sometimes we neglect to find joy when things don't go our way. And yet God is still in control, so that we should be rejoicing, scripture says, in everything and finding that. And I think David had a heart like that. He surrendered totally to God. And then when things went right, it was one thing. And we know from the future that when things aren't going to go his way with Saul, he also still continues to follow God and follow what he would have him to do.
Exactly right. Thanks, Lois, for that. Yeah, anyone else?
This is also how we grow in our faith, because with each thing that we face, even in us in life, you learn things this time that you have no idea you're going to need in your future.
Yeah, and God very clearly did that with David, right? David didn't know when he was delivered from the hand of the lion and the bear that, oh yeah, God's preparing me to fight a giant later in my life. But as he get into that circumstance, he said, oh, God's already done this for me. I can handle this too, because God's already given me and shown me that I can handle this situation. Yeah.
And I think David probably carried those stones with him from where he was. He had already picked them out in his little bag.
It does say he picked them up in the brook there as he went. So and that was.
But he picked up the best.
He would have picked up the best stones that he needed and wanted that he could do a good job with, and he was experienced with that, and God prepared him for that too. Yeah. All right. So just the last question there for us: how can we display trust and confidence in God's power to save even in difficult situations, right? And so God's with us, and just by way of closing with our time's sake here, to go to the Lord in prayer. To realize it's not our battle. These are the things we've been talking about. It's not our battle to win. God's already won it. And he won it on the cross. Our battle, our ultimate battle that we fight, God has already taken down our giant, the giant of sin. And it was representative combat. Jesus fought against Satan, and he defeated him through his death on the cross. He won the victory. And because of that, we are not servants of Satan. We're not slaves to him. God freed us from all of that through Christ. And so we can display trust and confidence. We can live knowing that the battle is already won. We don't go and act like we're slaves to this thing that's been defeated, because Jesus has won through the power of the cross. And so no matter what other circumstances we face that are results of sin in the world, we know that that enemy has been defeated, so we need not serve it anymore. Any other thoughts as we close? Yeah, Mom? You're making Dad get his steps as he goes back and forth, so. Yeah.
Sorry, I've talked so much. It never struck me before today that this was not just a fluke thing on David's part to wing the stone and hit Goliath. But it strikes me as being really similar to a Major League Baseball pitcher. I sometimes watch those pitchers. I don't understand the windup. I don't understand all the science and practice that's gone into where they put their weight and how they put their arm. They're not just winging a ball. It's just been years of honing and practicing. And then they're at 100 miles an hour, 90 to 100 miles an hour, throwing this ball and getting their target, which is quite small. And I never ever saw the similarities between the two, which strikes me then that really, besides the trust that we place in God to win the battle for us and fight the battle for us, there is a preparation there that is involved, whether that's being in the Word, probably primarily, growing in our faith, listening to the Word, being in situations like this and worship and all that. There's all that preparation. We don't know what we're going to need that for, other than our own personal growth. But it's a preparation in the battle. And I never saw that before today. I just never put that together.
And that preparation that God has done for David, David didn't necessarily know what he was preparing for. He thought he was just preparing to be a good shepherd. But God was preparing him to slay the giant. God was preparing him, as we saw, to later be king. God was preparing him to care for all those things. And so that preparation, God gives us the same way. Through his word, through the sacraments, through our baptism, through Bible class, through conversations, through difficult things in our life too. God prepares us to be equipped and ready to help others, right? Facing the lion or a bear was not something David would have chose to have done. But because he had faced that, he knew he could face whatever else God threw at him too. And the same for us. Sometimes we go through an illness or loss, and it's God preparing us, and we don't even know what it is for yet. But God's readying us for whatever that next thing is. So what an amazing God we serve, that loves us, that fights the battle, that wins for us. So let's go ahead and close with prayer. I know we're over time a little. So Heavenly Father, thank you so much for today, for the blessings that you give to us. Thank you for this, your word that just strengthens us and gives us peace and joy. Help us to trust in you. Help us to see the world as you see it. Help us to have your heart for others and for in zeal for your word and your name. Lord, help us and thank you for preparing us. Lord, we don't even know what you might be preparing us for yet, but we know that you do. And so we thank you for that preparation that you've already given and that you'll see us through whatever battle we face. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus, who is our Savior, the one who represents us and who has won the victory for us. In his name we pray. Amen. Thank you all. Good to see you guys. I'll mute my mic or my computer here. So if you want to talk a little bit more online, you can too.